The Asterian Ring was a staggering monument to cosmic hubris, an orbital academy suspended in the cold, unforgiving dark of the void. It had been designed to educate the elite offspring of dozens of intergalactic civilizations, serving as a melting pot for the future leaders of the galaxy. Its sweeping corridors and modular sectors stretched for hundreds of miles, a complex labyrinth of shifting atmospheric pressures, varying light spectra, and localized artificial gravities. To simply survive a walk to the cafeteria required a deep understanding of xenobiology. Deep within the heart of the station's academic sector, Tamsin Vale sat perfectly still in the middle row of the Interspecies Crisis Simulation Auditorium. The classroom was not merely a space for lectures. It was a highly advanced biomechanical theater designed to accommodate a bewildering array of biological needs. To her left, suspended in a towering cylindrical tank of hyper-oxygenated brine, a Tholaxian student lazily rippled its bioluminescent fins. To her right, 3 avian dignitaries from the high-altitude spires of Vale perched on sleek, magnetic rings, their hollow bones and crystalline feathers requiring only a fraction of standard gravity to avoid collapsing in on themselves. At the back of the expansive hall, enclosed within thick, pressurized methane domes, the massive, heavy worlders brooded in the shadows, their bodies built to withstand atmospheric pressures that would instantly crush a lesser being. And then, there was the human section. Tamsin sat in a standard, synthetic leather chair behind a flat, brushed metal desk. Her designated zone featured a modest climate control vent set to a pleasant 20 degrees Celsius. Exactly 1 standard gravity, and an unremarkable oxygen-nitrogen mixture. Among the floating perches, the fluid tanks, and the high-pressure chambers, the human area looked incredibly small and entirely devoid of danger. It looked like an afterthought. In the eyes of the wider galaxy, humanity itself was an afterthought. The official galactic codex entry for Homo sapiens read, "Moderately adaptable, devoid of psionic resonance, lacking notable biological advantages." It was a sterile, dismissive summary. Tamsin knew perfectly well that the codex entry was a convenient political label rather than the absolute truth. It was a camouflage that humanity wore like a drab cloak. The galaxy looked at her smooth skin, her lack of natural armored plating, her blunt teeth, and her singular, isolated mind. And they saw a creature that belonged comfortably at the bottom of the food chain. They did not see the dense, calcium-rich bone structure capable of withstanding immense, blunt force trauma. They did not comprehend the terrifying efficiency of the human adrenal system, capable of turning a terrified primate into a localized, explosive force of violence in a fraction of a second. They merely saw a quiet exchange student from a volatile world. Tamsin let them believe whatever made them feel secure. Her silence was her shield. Down at the front of the hall, Professor Orvek Tal paced rapidly across the expansive podium. The professor was a distinguished scholar of xenodynamics, an imposing entity possessing 6 articulated limbs and a complex sensory network that allowed him to physically feel the microscopic vibrations of localized force fields. Today, he was enthusiastically lecturing on the delicate art of preventing conflict escalation among cultures burdened with radically different threat instincts. The primary failure in interspecies diplomacy, Professor Tal projected, his voice translated through the universal earpieces into a smooth, genderless academic tone, is the fundamental misinterpretation of biological threat displays. What one species considers a polite gesture of submission, another instinctually interprets as the prelude to a lethal strike, baring teeth, flaring thermal signatures, releasing sudden pheromone bursts. Understanding the baseline defensive instincts of your counterpart is the absolute first step in neutralizing a crisis before blood is drawn. Tamsin did not take notes. She did not speak. She rarely did. Instead, she watched. while the rest of the class focused diligently on the holographic projections of aggressive posturing floating above the professor's head. Tamsin's sharp attention was caught by the subtle, wrong things happening in the physical space of the classroom itself. She noticed the details that the highly advanced, hyper-specialized alien minds around her simply filtered out as background noise. She felt it through the soles of her boots before she truly processed it. A sub-audible vibration, a tight, anxious hum in the metallic floor. It was irregular, pulsing just a fraction of a beat, off the standard rhythm of the station's massive life support systems. She shifted her gaze upward without moving her head. The ambient lighting arrays, designed to mimic the soothing solar spectra of a dozen different homeworlds, were flickering. The flicker was microscopic. A tiny stutter that was completely out of phase with the gravity regulators buried deep within the walls. The room was a sophisticated simulation chamber, deeply wired to generate hard light holograms and violently shift its environmental parameters to trap students in manufactured crises. Right now, the simulation was supposed to be completely dormant, yet the environmental sensors were bleeding stress. Tamsin traced the source of the anomaly. It led her eyes directly to the two students sitting in the row directly in front of her. The empty air between them was so thick with unvoiced, suffocating hostility that it felt like a physical, tangible barrier. On the left sat Kaylor Venn. He belonged to a proud, ancient lineage of aristocrats whose aggressive genetic manipulations over thousands of years had granted them the terrifying ability to bend and manipulate localized gravity. Kaylor sat with an effortless, imperious grace. Even when he was perfectly still, the tiny dust motes in the air seemed to orbit his broad shoulders, caught helplessly in the micro-fluctuations of his personal gravitational pull. On the right sat Eriex. Eriex was a being of a resonant mind, hailing from a strange, ethereal civilization, where the boundary between the individual ego and the collective consciousness was porous to the point of non-existence. For Eriex, a memory experienced by a distant ancestor on a dying world was felt just as intimately as a memory forged that very morning in the cafeteria. Their physical form was slender, wrapped tightly in a specialized neural-dampening mesh collar that prevented their ambient, broadcasting thoughts from deafening the unshielded minds sitting nearby. Down on the podium, Professor Tal, completely blind to the building atmospheric pressure in the center of the room, cheerfully brought up a new historical case study on the primary holoprojector. "Let us examine the border skirmishes of the 5th solar cycle," Professor Tal said, his multiple hands gesturing toward a three-dimensional star map that bloomed with harsh red warning markers. Specifically, the sudden evacuation protocols initiated in the contested outer rim zones. This represents a classic, tragic example of conflicting survival imperatives. It was a spectacular academic blunder. Tamsin saw Eriex's narrow shoulders go completely rigid. She saw the ambient light around Kaylor dim drastically as his gravity field unconsciously flared, swallowing the photons near his desk. The lesson had inadvertently brushed against a raw, bleeding historical nerve shared directly by those two specific species. Decades ago, during that very evacuation, Kaylor's empire had held the defensive line. They had established a brutal, unyielding quarantine to prevent a terrifying biological and ideological contagion from spreading into the core worlds. They hailed themselves as the pragmatic, necessary saviors of the sector. Eriex's people remembered it entirely differently, because they shared a collective memory. They held the eternal, screaming trauma of the desperate refugees who had been locked behind that defensive line. Eriex's civilization had formally accused Kaylor's empire of forced, systemic telepathic conditioning. They alleged that the empire had surgically altered, suppressed, and outright erased the memories of the civilian survivors to completely cover up the atrocities and war crimes committed in the name of maintaining that perfect quarantine. To Kaylor, it was a proud military heritage, To Irix, it was an open, festering wound that they felt burning in their own mind every single day. Tamsin gripped the edge of her synthetic leather desk, her knuckles turning white. The sub-audible hum in the floor grew noticeably sharper. The lights flickered again, a violent, sickening strobe that lasted only a fraction of a heartbeat. She realized with a sudden, cold clarity that the classroom itself was reacting to them. The simulation matrix, heavily wired to detect and escalate crisis scenarios for educational purposes, was actively picking up on the immense, uncontrolled emotional and biological outputs of the two enraged students. The room was far too sensitive. It was not merely recording the conflict, it was resonating with it, actively feeding the tension back into the air. It was waiting eagerly for the spark. The hall felt exactly like a highly pressurized gas cylinder, and Professor Tal was obliviously striking flint against the side of it. Kaylor shifted slightly in his seat, leaning his weight toward the narrow aisle that separated him from the resonant mind student. His voice was incredibly low, but in the tense, unnatural acoustic silence that had suddenly fallen over that section of the hall, it carried perfectly. "A fascinating case study," Kaylor murmured, his tone dripping with polished, aristocratic venom. "Though it is always exceptionally difficult to study history when certain species categorically refuse to look at the objective data. Your kind does not know how to respect the truth, only how to edit it to suit your collective victimhood." The air pressure in the room plummeted sharply. A harsh, metallic taste instantly flooded Tamsin's mouth, the physical, sickening byproduct of a massive, unshielded psionic spike building in the air. Irix turned their heads slowly. The neural dampening mesh tightly wound around their neck pulsed with an angry, blinding violet light as it struggled to contain the sheer force of their mind. When Irix spoke, their voice echoed with the overlapping, ghostly whispers of 1,000 angry ancestors, an auditory illusion that bypassed the ears completely and sank directly into the marrow of the bone. "And your empire," Irix replied, the words sharp enough to cut solid steel, "has never known how to distinguish order from oppression." The silence in the auditorium shattered instantly. Irix did not stop at the historical critique. They leaned forward, the dampening collar around their neck flashing a violent, blinding purple as they bypassed standard communication protocols. "Your noble house did not just establish a quarantine," Irix projected, their multi-layered voice tearing through the fabricated atmosphere of the human sector. "Your grandfather personally ordered the neural wiping of thousands of war orphans. You erased their grief, their families, and their very identities, all to exchange it for a politically convenient, fabricated peace treaty. You wear the blood and the hollowed-out minds of our children as a badge of order." The accusation was too precise, too devastatingly personal. Kaylor's regal composure snapped. He did not shout. He did not stand. Instead, his pupils dilated until his eyes were pools of absolute black, and the localized gravity field tethered to his biology violently inverted. The sheer, raw kinetic force slammed downward. The brushed metal desk in front of him shrieked with a high, agonizing wail of molecular distress before crumpling inward like crushed foil. Fasteners popped from the deck plating like bullets. The air around him shimmered, refracting light as the gravitational index spiked to 3, then 4 times the galactic standard. Pencils, data pads, and heavy water containers belonging to nearby students were yanked from their places, orbiting Kaylor in a jagged, lethal debris field, driven by sheer biological survival instinct. Irix lashed out. They thrust both hands forward to unleash a concentrated, concussive psionic pulse. It was intended to be a defensive shockwave to disrupt Kaylor's concentration before the gravity field could crush them. But Irix missed the critical variable. The interspecies crisis simulation matrix was already fully open and saturated with their escalating hostility. The system was actively scanning for emotional data to build a scenario. The psionic pulse slammed directly into the room's exposed environmental feedback sensors. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The sophisticated biomechanical theater did not just crash. It weaponized. The room abruptly transformed into a deadly, closed-loop resonance chamber. The central gravity regulator lost its axis. One side of the room experienced sudden zero gravity, sending avian students crashing brutally into the ceiling, while the opposite side spiked to a bone-crushing density, flattening the water in the tholaxian tanks until the glass began to spiderweb. Worse, the simulation system began reflecting the neural signals back into the physical space. The sensory overload was absolute. A violent mental storm swept through the enclosed space. The private memories, terrors, and fractured thoughts of over 50 different alien minds were ripped from their skulls and projected as overlapping, hallucinatory hard-light holograms. Phantoms of dying planets, screaming predators, and childhood traumas bled through the air, dragging every single student into a collective, waking nightmare of flashing lights and phantom pain. Down at the shattered podium, Professor Tal fought against a sudden localized gravity shear that pinned 3 of his 6 limbs to the floor. Frantically, he stretched a free appendage toward the master control console, slamming his palm onto the emergency override sequence. He intended to cut the power and drop the safety bulkheads. The corrupted system misinterpreted the command entirely, recognizing a multi-vector biological and structural threat. The artificial intelligence triggered a maximum security lockdown. Thick, impenetrable blast doors slammed shut over every exit. The atmospheric vents sealed tight. The auditorium was instantly converted into a living, pressurized cage, trapping the chaotic storm of gravity and psychic energy inside with them. The atmospheric pressure began to build steadily, pushing painfully against the eardrums of every breathing entity in the room. High above, the massive crystalline resonance lens, serving as the core projector for the room's hard-light holograms, could no longer withstand the conflicting gravitational tides, pulling it in opposite directions. With a deafening sound like a cracking glacier, the massive structure fractured. A jagged shard of hyper-dense glass, roughly the size of a small atmospheric shuttle, broke free. It plummeted downward, spinning like a guillotine blade. Directly beneath its trajectory sat Luma. She was a photobiotic being, her slender, translucent body composed entirely of solid-state light and fragile biopolymers. Her species possessed absolutely zero physical combat capabilities. They were gentle scholars of illumination, caught in the crushing grip of the ambient gravity field. Luma could not even raise her arms, let alone flee. She simply looked up, her internal light dimming in absolute, paralyzing terror as the jagged death plunged toward her. Nobody else moved. The heavily armored heavy worlders were pinned to the floor by their own augmented mass. The agile avians were trapped in the ceiling's anti-gravity pocket, thrashing wildly. The telepaths were screaming, blinded by the psychic storm tearing through their minds. Tamsin Vale moved. She did not hesitate. She did not calculate the physics. The human adrenal gland, an evolutionary masterpiece of desperate survival forged on a death world, flooded her system with a lethal cocktail of hormones in a fraction of a millisecond. Time dilated. She launched herself across the violently tilting deck. The floor beneath her feet buckled and twisted, the metal groaning as conflicting gravity waves tore at the seams. Tamsin sprinted through the chaotic gradients. Her dense, calcium-rich bones absorbed the punishing shifts in mass. She hit a zone of zero gravity, used the momentum to hurl herself forward, and crashed into a pocket of triple gravity, her knees bending deep to absorb the brutal impact without breaking her stride. She reached Luma's desk exactly 1 second before the impact. Tamsin did not try to stop the shard. She simply grabbed the terrified photobiotic girl by the waist, using her own forward momentum to tackle Luma backward, launching them both entirely out of the kill zone. The massive crystalline blade slammed into Luma's desk, shattering the metal into fine dust and embedding itself deep into the deck plating, right where the girl had been sitting a breath earlier. The concussive wave of the impact sent Tamsin sliding across the floor, shielding Luma's fragile body with her own back. Tamsin scrambled to her feet, ignoring the stinging pain where a secondary glass splinter had grazed her cheek. The air in the room was boiling. The pressure was reaching a critical, fatal threshold. At the center of the storm, Kaelor and Irix were locked in a death spiral, completely oblivious to the destruction they had unleashed. Kaelor raised his right hand. The air above his palm warped into a terrifying, light-swallowing sphere. He was actively synthesizing a miniature gravity collapse particle, a localized black hole that would shred the molecular bonds of anything it touched. The sheer, agonizing effort caused the delicate blood vessels in his eyes to rupture, streaming crimson down his face. 10 feet away, Irix was levitating, their physical form vibrating at a lethal frequency. They had bypassed all dampening protocols and were gathering the totality of their collective ancestral agony into a single, cohesive, psionic spike. It was a weapon specifically designed to bypass physical armor and directly liquefy an opponent's cerebral cortex. They were going to murder each other. The resulting release of kinetic and psychic energy would undoubtedly vaporize the sealed classroom and everyone trapped inside. The other students could only watch in mute, paralyzed horror. Death was absolutely certain. Tamsin looked at the swirling gravity particle. She looked at the blinding psionic spike. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the room, the terrifying alien forces that reduced her species to a mere footnote in the galactic registry. Then, she exhaled, her breath steady and calm amidst the roaring chaos. Without a weapon, without armor, and without a single psionic ability to her name, the human girl stepped directly into the center of the aisle, placing her fragile, unshielded body squarely between the two most lethal forces in the room. The deck plating beneath Tamsin's boots groaned, a deep structural protest against the localized gravity Kaelor had weaponized. The kinetic pressure was designed to crush carbon-based lifeforms into a dense, unrecognizable smear on the floor. It hit Tamsin like a falling cargo hauler. The synthetic leather of her boots began to crack. The metal floor buckled, splintering inward under her weight to form a shallow crater. She did not fall. She did not scream. The human skeletal structure, forged by millennia of existence on an unforgiving, high-gravity world, locked into absolute rigidity. Her knees bent, dropping her center of mass by precisely 3 inches. Her muscles bunched, absorbing the catastrophic weight not as a victim facing execution, but as a seasoned weightlifter casually catching a heavy beam. The brutal, impossible physics of her stance made the air in the auditorium seem to freeze. She stood directly inside a lethal anomaly, her posture utterly calm, anchoring herself against a force that would have shattered the hollow bones of the avian students in a microsecond. Blinded by the escalating power of his own spatial collapse particle, Kaelor failed to register the impossibility of her survival. Irix, however, did not miss her presence. Driven by the sheer panic of an escalating battlefield, the resonant mind student lashed out telepathically, seeking to paralyze the nearest biological target before unleashing their lethal psionic spike. Their mind reached across the space and slammed violently into Tamsin's consciousness. It was a catastrophic, traumatizing mistake. Irix had been trained to read standard alien neural pathways. They expected a linear, logical prey-response protocol, absolute terror, submissive static, or the simple, clean quiet of a frozen nervous system. What Irix breached instead was a roaring, untamed hurricane of biological chaos. The human mind was a terrifying labyrinth of contradictory frequencies existing simultaneously. Irix drowned instantly in a non-standard storm of raw data. They felt the heavy, relentless drumming of Tamsin's adrenaline-soaked heart, completely at odds with the icy, calculated logic center mapping out a tactical takedown. They experienced the agonizing sting of a recent paper cut echoing inexplicably louder than the abstract fear of imminent death. Erix was battered by fragments of ridiculous, nonsensical humor layered directly over a deep, ancestral grief, all intertwined with a ferocious, feral instinct to bite back. It was a biologically impossible cacophony. No sane species compartmentalize their minds like this. Erix gasped, physically reeling backward in the air as the sheer, agonizing noise of a single human consciousness overloaded their delicate telepathic filters. Tamsin did not wait for either of them to recover from their shock. She moved. She stepped deeper into Kaylor's inverted gravity field, pushing through the invisible density like a swimmer breaking through a heavy current. Her right hand snapped out. It was a blur of raw, unaugmented kinetic speed. She bypassed the swirling, light-swallowing sphere of destruction and clamped her fingers directly around Kaylor's wrist, just a fraction of a second before the anomaly finalized. Her grip was brutal, locking around his bones like a vice forged of cold steel. With a sharp, precise twist of her hips, Tamsin manipulated his own biological leverage against him. She violently forced his arm upward, breaking his concentration and altering the trajectory of the field. The spatial distortion particle tore free from his control. Instead of expanding outward to vaporize the students in the front row, the sphere launched straight up. It struck the high, vaulted ceiling and detonated, silently consuming a massive section of the overhead ventilation shaft in a flash of dark energy before fizzling into nothing. In the exact same moment, her right hand neutralized the gravity bender. Tamsin's left hand found a jagged piece of a shattered metal desk bar lying on the tilted floor. She did not pick it up. She simply struck the steel exactly 3 times with her knuckles. Clack, clack, clack. It was not a random, panicked gesture. It was a calculated, acoustic counter-frequency. The sharp, harsh, physical rhythm acted as a sudden phase breaker against the looping psionic resonance that Erix had inadvertently flooded into the room. It shattered the telepathic echo chamber. The auditory shockwave severed the link between the room's environmental sensors and the students' panicked minds. The horrifying hard-light holograms, flickering across the auditorium, dissolved into static and vanished instantly. Robbed of its emotional fuel, the simulation matrix crashed into a hard reboot. The atmospheric pressure equalized with a heavy sigh. The scene froze completely. Nobody in the auditorium possessed the tactical framework to comprehend the underlying physics or the psychological mechanics of what had just occurred. They only processed the sheer, raw visual data standing before them. A completely unarmored, biologically unremarkable human exchange student was standing perfectly still in the ruined aisle. She had one hand securely locked around the wrist of a gravity-bending noble, and her mere presence had somehow shattered the mind of a telepathic weapon of mass destruction. She had neutralized the 2 most dangerous entities in the Academy without firing a single shot, deploying a single shield, or utilizing any known psionic ability. High above, the automated defense grid of the classroom finally caught up to the biological spikes. The artificial intelligence scanned the wreckage, desperately searching for the apex predator responsible for the catastrophic power surge. It completely ignored Kaylor. It dismissed Erix. The targeting reticles snapped firmly onto Tamsin. Her heart rate, cortisol levels, and sudden explosive kinetic output were currently shattering every single parameter registered in the galactic database for her species. The system flagged her as an unregistered anomaly, a supreme biological threat. A heavy ceiling hatch snapped open with a metallic hiss, deploying an electrified neural restraint net. The weapon was specifically designed to drop from above and instantly paralyze massive, heavy-world predators through overwhelming voltage. It plummeted directly toward her. Tamsin did not dive away to save herself. She did not summon an impossible surge of physical strength to tear the falling mesh apart to prove her dominance. She simply calculated the descent trajectory in a microsecond. Pivoting smoothly on her heel, she physically dragged both Kaylor and Erix out of the drop zone by their collars, hurling them onto the stable deck plating behind her. In one continuous, fluid motion, she reached out and caught the very edge of the descending electrified net. She used its own heavy momentum to whip it violently sideways, guiding the charged mesh directly into the cracked, sparking core of the master control console. The highly charged net entangled with the exposed wiring of the rebooting simulation matrix. A massive, blinding power surge arced through the room. The grid short-circuited entirely. The net died instantly, its internal capacitors blowing out, leaving it to slump to the floor as a useless, smoking pile of synthetic wire. The silence that followed was significantly more terrifying than the previous explosions. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a fundamental truth being completely rewritten in real time. Kaylor remained on his knees, staring blankly down at his right arm. His wrist was rapidly bruising, the delicate alien tendons aching from a grip that felt like industrial machinery. Iriax was curled tightly into a ball against the wall, clutching the sides of their head, panting heavily as their mind desperately tried to purge the chaotic, terrifying residue of human consciousness they had accidentally touched. The rest of the class collectively shuffled backward. It was a slow, synchronized movement born of pure, primal apprehension. They retreated from the center aisle, as if Tamsin had just transformed into an open rift, leading directly into a black hole. The human zone, previously ignored as the weakest, safest corner of the room, was suddenly the epicenter of an unknown, terrifying phenomenon. They looked at her smooth skin, her lack of natural weapons, her steady breathing, and realized they had absolutely no idea what she actually was. A single voice broke the absolute stillness. It was a faint, trembling whisper coming from the high-altitude avian perches near the ceiling, voicing the question that was echoing through every alien mind in the room. What are humans, truly? Tamsin released her rigid posture. She reached up and calmly adjusted her collar, brushing a fine layer of pulverized glass off her shoulder. Her expression remained completely unreadable, her voice steady, flat, and entirely devoid of arrogance. A species that learned to survive in the middle of storms. The official inquiry concluded exactly 12 hours after the atmospheric seals on the simulation hall were breached. The Faculty Security Council, a tribunal composed of 7 elder species, reviewed the raw sensor data and definitively cleared Tamsin of any aggressive intent. The official mandate stated clearly that her actions were entirely defensive, mitigating a catastrophic structural failure and preventing multiple fatalities. She was legally free to go. However, the truth possessed the agonizingly slow pace of bureaucracy, while fear moved at the speed of light. Long before the first digital signature dried on the dean's incident report, unedited security footage of the altercation had bypassed the Academy's central firewalls. It flooded the personal data slates of nearly 50,000 students across the entire orbital ring. It played in the sleek, sanitized dining halls. It looped in the zero-gravity recreation spheres, and it was projected in the subterranean engineering bays. They watched a seemingly fragile primate step into a zone of absolute destruction and casually tear apart the fundamental laws of interspecies combat. And then, driven by a sudden, primal terror, the student body began to dig. The galactic archives regarding Sector 7, System Sol, planet Earth, experienced a spike in traffic unseen in 100 solar cycles. Alien scholars, accustomed to highly engineered, harmonious biospheres, stared in absolute horror at the raw, unfiltered planetary data. They read about a tectonically unstable sphere, constantly ravaged by Category 5 atmospheric anomalies. They learned about vast oceans composed of corrosive salt water, teeming with aggressive aquatic predators. They studied the microscopic, parasitic life forms that constantly waged war within the human bloodstream just to maintain baseline health. Most terrifying of all, they scrolled through an unbroken, 10,000-year historical record of localized, brutal, and ceaseless kinetic warfare. Earth was not a gentle cradle of civilization. It was a planetary crucible, an evolutionary meat grinder that only produced apex survivors. In the telepathic resonance dormitories, psionic students huddled together in the dark, attempting to dissect the brief, chaotic imprint Tamsin's mind had left on the localized grid. The results terrified them even more than the physical combat footage. They discovered that the human brain simply did not rest. It was not a quiet, orderly engine running on a single track. It was a churning, chaotic storm of overlapping frequencies. Standard neural calming techniques, the very foundation of galactic psychiatric medicine, were deemed completely useless against a consciousness that could simultaneously process profound grief, calculated physical geometry, and profoundly irrational humor. To a telepath, approaching a human mind was like trying to drink from a high-pressure fire hose of raw emotion. Meanwhile, the biomechanical and engineering faculties obsessed over the physical telemetry. They watched the replay of Tamsin bracing against the kinetic pressure wave over and over again, slowing the footage down to a fraction of a second. They ran the numbers on her bone density, discovering a skeletal matrix significantly thicker and more calcium-rich than the galactic average. They isolated the chemical signature of her adrenal response, realizing with mounting dread that human biology could voluntarily weaponize its own stress, pushing the body into short-term, explosive states of hyper-lethality. Furthermore, their medical models could not establish a reliable baseline for human pain tolerance. The data suggested a human could succumb entirely to a microscopic toxin, yet completely ignore a severed limb if the psychological motivation to protect something was high enough. It was profoundly illogical. It was deeply dangerous. The social fallout was immediate and absolute. When Tamsin walked into the central atmospheric cafeteria the following afternoon, the dull roar of 1,000 alien voices died instantly. It was not a gradual, polite quieting. It was an abrupt, suffocating silence, as if all the oxygen had been violently vented from the massive room. Students paused with their feeding tubes and nutrient forks suspended frozen in midair. As she moved toward the dispenser line, the crowd parted. A 30-foot radius of empty space formed naturally around her, a physical, undeniable manifestation of their dread. Nobody made eye contact. When she finally sat down at an isolated corner table with her synthesized protein tray, the surrounding tables emptied within 30 seconds. The isolation followed her relentlessly into the corridors. Vibrant, bustling conversations in the transit tubes ceased the exact moment she stepped through the pressure doors. Alien eyes, faceted, compound, and bioluminescent, tracked her every movement with the wary, calculated intensity of prey, watching a predator stalk through the tall grass. The most hollow victory came that evening when she returned to her assigned living quarters. Tamsin shared a 3-person suite with a crystalline silica-based being and an atmospheric glider from a low-density gas giant. When the heavy blast door slid open, she found the common room completely stripped of their personal belongings. There was no note left on the counter. There was no digital apology sent to her comms. They had submitted emergency transfer requests to the housing authority and relocated to the extreme opposite side of the Academy ring before the sun even set on the local rotational cycle. She sat alone on the edge of her standard issue cot. The room felt immense and terribly cold. The crushing weight of the injustice settled heavily against her ribs. The student body had watched the unedited footage. They had seen Kalor nearly crush the room into a localized singularity. They had seen Erix prepare to wipe their classmates' minds clean. They had seen Tamsin dive through a storm of shattered glass to pull Luma out of the path of certain death. Yet, they did not fear the aristocrat who lost his temper, nor the telepath who lost control. They feared the human who had stopped them both. They completely erased the act of salvation, blinded entirely by the terrifying capacity of the biology that performed it. A soft, synthetic chime echoed from her personal data slate, resting on the metal desk. Tamsin picked it up. It was a heavily encrypted, text-only transmission routed through 3 different external proxy servers. The sender identification was completely masked, but the biometric signature attached to the decryption key belonged undeniably to Luma. The message contained exactly 2 sentences. "Thank you for saving my life. Please do not reply to this channel." Tamsin read the glowing white text until the letters began to blur together. She pressed the cold slate against her chest, letting out a long, shuddering breath in the empty room. The message was a fragile, tiny ember of warmth in a freezing, hostile void. Luma understood. Luma remembered the truth. But the strict anonymity, the absolute terror of being digitally associated with her, starkly illuminated the invisible, insurmountable wall that had slammed down between Tamsin and the rest of the universe. Unable to sleep in the suffocating silence of the empty suite, Tamsin wandered through the darkened, maintenance-level corridors until she reached the uppermost observation dome. It was a massive, transparent blister protruding from the station's outer composite hull, offering an unobstructed, terrifyingly beautiful view of the galactic core. Swirling nebulas of violet and crushed gold stretched across the infinite black canvas of space. She leaned her forehead against the cold, reinforced star glass. The sheer, incomprehensible scale of the cosmos usually brought her a deep sense of peace, a comforting reminder of how small her own problems were in the grand scheme of things. Tonight, it only magnified her profound sense of alienation. She stared at the distant, burning stars and wondered about the heavy, inescapable burden of her own DNA. Would she ever be allowed to just be Tamsin Vale? Or was she doomed to spend the rest of her life as a walking ambassador for a biological nightmare? The galaxy looked at her and saw only the violent, raging storms of Earth, the brutal history of her ancestors, and the terrifying, unyielding density of her bones. They judged her not by the choices she made in the heat of the moment, but by the evolutionary sins of her entire species. She felt like a prisoner of her own biology, convicted by a universe that valued predictable order far above anything else. She stayed there for 3 hours, watching the slow, majestic rotation of the celestial bodies, letting the freezing silence of deep space numb the sharp, throbbing ache in her chest. Finally, as the internal chronometer signaled the beginning of the morning shift, Tamsin pushed herself away from the glass. She needed to prepare for the inevitable hostile stares and the deafening silence in the morning lectures. Just as she turned toward the heavy exit hatch, her data slate vibrated violently in her pocket. It was not a standard communication ping. It was a high-level, forced entry packet that bypassed her personal firewall completely. A single, highly compressed data fragment decoded itself directly onto the center of her screen. There was no sender identification, no routing history, and absolutely no digital footprint whatsoever. Tamsin stared at the stark text glowing against the dark background. The explosion in the classroom was not entirely an accident. The glow of the cryptic message faded into the dark background of Tamsin's data slate. She had exactly 0 seconds to analyze the chilling implication that the catastrophic failure in the simulation hall had been intentionally engineered. A sharp, echoing clatter of metal against composite plating shattered the quiet isolation of the upper observation decks. The distinct sound of a physical altercation drifted up from the lower maintenance arteries, flanking the hydroponic botany sector, a restricted area usually occupied only by automated pollinator drones during the 3rd shift. Tamsin slipped her slate into her uniform pocket. Her footsteps made absolutely no sound as she descended the spiraling transit stairwell, letting her heightened senses guide her through the dimly lit corridors. The heavy, humid air of the botanical wing smelled strongly of ozone, nutrient paste, and crushed chlorophyll. Around a tight bend in the maintenance artery, pinned securely against a massive climate control pipeline, stood Luma. The fragile, photobiotic girl was trembling violently, her internal illumination flickering erratically in a display of sheer biological panic. Blocking her singular escape route were three towering figures. They belonged to a fiercely militaristic caste from the inner core worlds, a species genetically engineered for grinding trench warfare. They boasted thick, overlapping dermal plating, dense muscle mass, and a cultural arrogance that demanded absolute submission from weaker beings. The leader of the trio leaned aggressively close to Luma, his voice a harsh, demanding gravel that echoed down the pipelined hall. He was explicitly forcing her to hand over her highly encrypted biometric access codes to the Academy's rare, ancient photobiotic tree network. The proprietary data was strictly protected, but the soldiers needed it to plagiarize a highly prestigious end-of-term presentation, and they had absolutely no intention of doing the actual academic labor themselves. Tamsin stepped quietly out of the shadows. She did not shout a heroic warning. She did not adopt an aggressive combat stance or bare her teeth in a primate threat display. She merely walked forward and stopped at the precise center of the narrowest choke point in the corridor, positioning her body exactly where the overhead maintenance tracks converged with the floor plating. The three aggressors snapped their attention toward her. Their heavy jaws tightened. They immediately attempted to project an aura of bored, violent superiority. But the subtle, anxious shifting of their weight betrayed their internal state. They had all watched the leaked security footage from the simulation hall. They knew exactly who she was. They did not retreat. Instead, their posture stiffened. This was no longer just a simple act of academic extortion. It had instantly become a live-fire validation test. They wanted to prove to themselves and the galaxy that the terrifying rumors surrounding the lone human exchange student were nothing more than exaggerated, hysterical gossip. The narrow corridor was a complex geometric puzzle, and Tamsin had completely solved the spatial equations before the first alien muscle twitched. The leader lunged forward. He drew a handheld, heavy-duty ultrasonic cutter from his tactical belt. The high-frequency blade hummed with enough concentrated kinetic energy to smoothly slice through a pressurized starship hull. He aimed a wide, horizontal sweep directly at her chest, intending to gut her in a single, brutal motion. Tamsin did not attempt to block the lethal weapon with her unarmored arms. She did not throw a counterpunch. She simply waited until the humming blade was a fraction of an inch away from her uniform, and then she tilted her torso exactly 15 degrees backward. The movement was incredibly minimal, a masterclass in kinetic efficiency. The ultrasonic cutter hissed through empty air and bit deeply into the exposed, highly sensitive diagnostic sensor panel mounted on the bulkhead directly behind her. The Academy's automated damage control system reacted instantaneously to the severed conduit. A heavy, emergency blast shutter slammed down from the ceiling to seal off the perceived atmospheric breach, crashing onto the deck with a deafening thud. It dropped precisely between the leader and his two subordinates, instantly bisecting their tactical formation. The leader was securely trapped on the far side of the steel wall, completely removed from the combat equation in exactly 2 seconds. The second attacker roared in anger, charging blindly down the left flank of the narrow corridor. He lowered his heavily plated shoulder, relying entirely on his overwhelming mass and momentum to crush the human against the unyielding metal pipes. Tamsin remained perfectly still, her breathing slow and measured. Resting near her right heel was a heavy, suspended magnetic tool cart utilized by the nocturnal engineering drones. Just as the charging student entered her immediate strike zone, Tamsin casually tapped the cart's repulsor release lever with the toe of her boot. She applied exactly enough force to slide the heavy metal cart smoothly into his direct trajectory. The massive alien tripped hard over his own ferocious velocity. The sudden introduction of the cart shattered his center of gravity. He launched helplessly into the air and slammed head-first into the thick, impact-absorbent insulation padding lining the main water pipe. The heavy, meaty thud was followed by absolute stillness. He slid to the floor, completely unconscious, without a single drop of blood spilled or a single bone fractured. Panic completely seized the third and final attacker. Finding himself suddenly alone against the motionless human, he frantically reached for his tactical rig, unclipping a localized concussive stun device. He clearly intended to detonate it at point-blank range, hoping to blind them both long enough to cover his desperate escape. Tamsin finally moved toward him, closing the distance in two smooth, completely silent strides. She did not strike his face. She did not wrench his arm out of its socket, though she possessed the physical strength to do so easily. She simply reached past his trembling hand and drove her palm firmly into the environmental override panel embedded in the wall behind his shoulder. Her fingers danced rapidly across the glass interface, engaging a manual feedback loop that routed the corridor's immediate security grid directly into the frequency of the unshielded stun device he was holding. The device did not detonate outward. Instead, it triggered the corridor's automated hazardous material containment protocol. A shimmering, high-density stasis mesh erupted from the floor and ceiling, instantly hardening into a rigid cage of solid light. The third attacker was frozen in place, his arm, raised in a throwing motion, caught completely helpless in a secure trap he had essentially activated himself. The entire physical altercation had lasted less than 12 seconds. Tamsin stood perfectly untouched in the center of the hall, her hands resting calmly at her sides. The heavy, ringing silence was soon broken by the quiet, unified hum of dozens of recording devices. A large crowd of nocturnal students had quietly gathered at the far ends of the corridor, holding up their data slates to record the aftermath of the brief encounter. The footage they were capturing was fundamentally more chilling than the raw, explosive destruction of the classroom incident. Every single student watching understood basic physics. They knew Tamsin possessed the biological density and raw kinetic power to easily shatter the thick skulls of all three armored attackers. She could have crippled them permanently with very little effort. Instead, she had orchestrated their total defeat using only their own blind aggression, the physical environment, and absolute, flawless discipline. She actively chose the path of zero permanent harm. To the watching alien minds, this absolute restraint was infinitely more terrifying than mindless violence. A beast that attacked everything in sight could be categorized, hunted, and eventually destroyed. But a monster that could calculate spatial geometry mid-combat, manipulate its enemies, and consciously choose to spare its prey was a predator of an entirely different, unfathomable magnitude. The fear shifted from her physical strength to her psychological control. A squad of automated security drones hummed rapidly down the corridor, their blue emergency lights painting the metallic walls in harsh, shifting tones. The machines mechanically raised the fallen blast shutter and dragged the groggy, furious leader to his feet to apply heavy magnetic restraint cuffs. The defeated soldier spat violently onto the deck plating. He glared at Tamsin, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of humiliated rage and dawning realization. "You think you are so clever, primate," the leader hissed, his voice echoing loudly off the overhead pipes for the entire crowd to hear. "You think you actually won something here tonight. That whole disaster in the simulation hall was never a simple equipment malfunction. It was a live fire stress test. The High Council orchestrated the exact pressure parameters to see exactly how the pet human would react before they formally vote on whether to give your pathetic species a permanent seat on the Galactic Council." Tamsin watched the drones haul him roughly away into the dark. Her facial expression remained a mask of total neutrality, giving the whispering crowd absolutely nothing to analyze. However, behind her steady eyes, a profound, chilling realization locked firmly into place. The hostility in the cafeteria, the isolated incidents of sabotage, the perfectly timed historical provocations designed to set Kalor and Irix against each other in class. They were not random acts of immature student rivalry. She was not merely an outcast exchange student trying to quietly survive the academic semester. She had been unknowingly placed at the absolute center of a massive, high-stakes galactic chess game. The invisible players moving the pieces were testing the fundamental nature of humanity. And Tamsin suddenly understood that surviving the test was no longer enough. She had to take control of the board. The official summons arrived precisely at the beginning of the morning cycle, bypassing all standard student communication channels to flash directly onto Tamsin's secured data slate. She was directed to the absolute geometric zenith of the station, a restricted spire where the artificial gravity grew intentionally dense, filtering out the casual wanderers. The doors to the headmaster's sanctum were completely devoid of the smart metal composites found everywhere else on the orbital ring. Instead, they were carved from the petrified heartwood of a long-extinct planetary forest, radiating an aura of immense, quiet authority. Tamsin stepped inside. The office did not look like an administrative hub. It was a vast, circular chamber lined with physical, bound books from 1,000 different civilizations, smelling faintly of dried ink and the stellar dust. Standing by the central observation window was Headmaster Elira Sen. Elira was a being of profound, incomprehensible age. Her physical form was roughly humanoid, yet her skin shimmered with the slow, swirling luminescence of a trapped nebula, shifting between deep indigo and burning gold with every breath she took. She belonged to a species that perceived time not as a rushing river, but as a vast, static landscape. The headmaster was a legendary figure across the cosmos, famously spending entire decades in silent, undisturbed observation. She only intervened in the daily affairs of the living when a tectonic shift in galactic politics was imminent. "You are currently the most valuable and the most dangerous variable in this quadrant," Miss Vale, Elira said without turning around. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed the heavy, undeniable resonance of shifting tectonic plates. Tamsin stood firmly in the center of the room, her posture respectful but unyielding. "I was only defending myself and the other students. I have no interest in galactic politics." Elira finally turned, her nebula eyes locking onto the human. "Interest is irrelevant. The events of the past 2 days have already been dissected by the highest echelons of the Galactic Council. 2 distinct, highly aggressive factions are currently weaponizing your existence. The conservative bloc views your biological profile as a latent plague, arguing that humanity is an uncontrollable threat that must be permanently quarantined or purged before it spreads. The opposing militaristic bloc looks at your tactical restraint and sees a devastating vanguard that could be harnessed, domesticated, and directed against their political enemies." The headmaster paced slowly toward a large, circular dais in the middle of the floor. "Both sides are entirely wrong about what you actually are, but ignorance has never stopped an empire from going to war." Tamsin felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The hallway ambush had just been the beginning. "Why tell me this? I am just one exchange student. I cannot control what the council fleets do. Because this station is not what it appears to be," Elira stated softly. She reached out and touched the surface of the dais. Instantly, the heavy wooden floor beneath their feet dissolved into perfect transparency. Tamsin gasped slightly, stepping back as she found herself staring down into a colossal, dizzying abyss. The Asterian ring was not solid. It was hollow, and suspended in the dead center of that immense, pressurized void was a machine. It defied all known architectural logic. It was a staggering geometric nightmare, composed of interlocking rings of dark, featureless metal, slowly rotating around a blindingly bright core of pure, contained energy. It looked less like a machine and more like a sleeping, mechanical god. "The academy was built around this," Elira explained, her voice tinged with a rare note of absolute reverence. "It is the ancient archive, a relic left behind by a pre-galactic civilization that vanished millions of years before the first known alien species learned how to forge iron. We do not know who they were. We only know what the machine was designed to do. Tamsin stared at the impossibly massive rings, feeling a strange, vibrating pressure in the back of her teeth. "What does it do?" "It judges," Elira replied simply. "It evaluates a civilization's fundamental right to inherit the stars." For centuries, the greatest empires in this galaxy have brought their finest minds and their strongest warriors here, attempting to activate the core and claim the ultimate authority it supposedly grants. Every single one of them has failed. The headmaster looked away from the machine and focused her piercing gaze directly on Tamsin. The archive does not measure raw kinetic power. It does not care about technological supremacy or psionic capability. It evaluates a species based on its capacity to hold contradictory truths without destroying itself. The empires of the core worlds failed because they are obsessed with absolute, rigid order. They shatter the moment they encounter moral chaos. The conquering syndicates failed because their instinct for expansion eventually consumes their own foundations. Elira stepped closer. The ambient light of the room, dimming as the machine below them, seemed to pulse with a slow, waking rhythm. A civilization must be capable of intense violence to protect itself, yet possess the profound empathy required to spare its enemies. It must understand the cold, calculating mathematics of survival, while simultaneously valuing the illogical beauty of art and mercy. It demands perfect equilibrium within a state of absolute chaos. The cold knot in Tamsin's stomach turned to ice. She suddenly understood exactly where this conversation was leading. "When the environmental simulation collapsed yesterday," Elira continued, "the ancient archive reacted for the first time in 10,000 solar cycles. The ambient energy of the dispute did not wake it. Your specific biological and psychological footprint did. It resonated with the impossible storm inside your mind. That is why the High Council hardliners panicked. They orchestrated the hostile encounters to push you, hoping you would break and prove you were nothing but a mindless predator. They did not want to kill you. They wanted to expose you to the machine as a failure." "They wanted a monster," Tamsin said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And I gave them a pacifist instead." "You gave them a paradox," Elira corrected her. "And that terrifies them more than any weapon." The headmaster walked back to her desk and picked up a ceremonial data crystal. "Next week is the Civilization Integration Summit. It is the most heavily broadcast event of the decade, watched by trillions of sentient beings. Traditionally, new species are paraded on stage to apologize for their primitive origins and beg for a minor seat at the table. I am officially overriding the curriculum." Elira held the crystal out. "I want you to lead the human presentation. I do not want you to act like a victim. I do not want you to pose as a savior. I want you to present humanity exactly as it is, with all of its glorious, terrifying contradictions." Tamsin did not take the crystal. She crossed her arms, her jaw setting into a stubborn line. "I hate being a symbol. I am not a politician. If I stand up there, they will dissect every word I say and use it to justify whatever war they have already decided to wage." "Perhaps," Elira acknowledged, her expression unreadable. "But right now, the only thing in this universe more dangerous than the brutal truth is allowing your enemies to tell that truth for you. If you remain silent, they will paint your people as mindless beasts, and the eradication fleets will be authorized before the semester ends." The heavy silence stretched between them, accompanied only by the deep, subsonic hum of the massive relics suspended beneath their feet. Tamsin looked down at the dark rings, feeling the immense, crushing weight of her entire species resting squarely on her shoulders. She had traveled across the galaxy to learn about alien cultures, and instead, she was being tasked with defending the very soul of her own. Before Tamsin could offer her final answer, the ambient temperature in the office plummeted. The transparent floor flashed with a blinding, searing white light. Both the human and the ancient headmaster staggered back as the ancient archive suddenly accelerated its rotation. The dark metal rings spun into a blur, and a massive projection of light shot straight up through the floor, filling the room with swirling, archaic symbols that had not been seen since the dawn of the universe. Elira's eyes widened in absolute shock, a reaction Tamsin assumed the ancient being had not experienced in millennia. The headmaster raised a trembling hand, activating the room's master translation matrix. The archaic symbols shifted, realigning themselves into the standardized galactic script. The glowing words hung suspended in the air between them, casting long, sharp shadows against the wooden walls. Guardian candidate detected. Homo sapiens. The projection faded as quickly as it had appeared, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Tamsin stared at the empty air, her heart pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The universe had just stopped watching her. It had just called her name. Tamsin accepted the headmaster's proposition with a singular, unyielding condition. There would be no filtered narratives, and absolutely no gentle diplomatic softening. If humanity was going to present itself to the galactic stage, she demanded they be shown as a complete, unfiltered portrait. She wanted the intricate music, the complex poetry, and the relentless scientific curiosity displayed right alongside the brutal wars, the profound historical shame, and the terrifying, beautiful capacity to rebuild civilization from the ashes. She refused to let her species beg for acceptance by pretending to be harmless. To construct this massive projection of the human soul, an improbable interspecies support group slowly coalesced around her in a quiet, disused corner of the hydroponic gardens. Luma was the first to arrive. The fragile photobiotic girl still physically flinched when Tamsin moved too quickly, but she bravely volunteered to manage the complex bioluminescent interfaces required to project Earth's raw data into the auditorium. Kalor approached them 2 days later. He swallowed his deep aristocratic pride and offered to act as the gravitational anchor, using his abilities to stabilize the massive, erratic data streams his own localized spatial collapse had previously corrupted. Finally, Erix joined the circle. The resonant mind student was the only one capable of safely diving into the human historical archives to translate the raw, emotional weight of Earth into a sensory format the alien audience could actually feel. Placing Kalor and Irix at the same work table immediately generated a suffocating friction. The air constantly smelled of ozone and tasted of copper. The gravity around their workstations fluctuated wildly, and low-level psychic static gave everyone a persistent headache. They refused to speak directly to each other, acting as rigid, silent representatives of their ancestors' blood feud. Tamsin tolerated it for exactly 48 hours before she slammed her hands flat against the metal table, the sharp sound echoing through the quiet garden. She demanded they stop fighting ghosts. She forced them to remain seated, refusing to let them leave until they looked at the person sitting across from them. She pointed out that Kalor was just a student carrying a debt he did not earn, and Erix was just a scholar, drowning in memories that were not their own. It was a terribly uncomfortable, agonizingly tense afternoon. But slowly, the invisible armor began to crack. They stopped glaring at the historical symbols of their mutual hatred, and finally started seeing the exhausted, terrified teenagers underneath. The true breakthrough, however, came from the data itself. While cataloging a massive file of Earth's history, Erix suddenly gasped and severed their neural connection, clutching their dampening collar in absolute shock. Tamsin immediately asked if the psychic feedback had burned them. Erix shook their head, their voice trembling with profound confusion. They explained that they had just interfaced with a human memory of a catastrophic global siege. In standard alien psychology, a war zone memory was a singular, monolithic block of pure terror. But in the human archive, Irix found a soldier in a freezing, mud-filled trench, making a completely absurd joke about the quality of their synthesized rations. The profound grief of losing comrades and the genuine warm humor of the joke were firing along the exact same neural pathways. Irix was stunned to discover that for humans, bidirectional emotions were not a flaw. Tragedy and love, terror and comedy, they were intricately woven into the exact same biological nerve. Across the table, Kaylor was experiencing his own paradigm shift. He was tasked with reviewing the kinetic telemetry of human physical feats. He sat mesmerized before a holographic projection showing a localized planetary disaster on Earth, a massive subterranean collapse trapping dozens of miners. Kaylor watched, completely baffled, as unarmored, biologically fragile humans willingly strapped themselves into primitive harnesses and plunged into the unstable, crumbling darkness. He watched them dig with their bare hands until their fingers bled, desperate to reach strangers they had never even met. He looked up at Tamsin, his dark eyes wide with genuine lack of comprehension. He stated that her species was recorded as fiercely territorial, capable of waging wars that could glass entire continents. He could not understand why a creature forged in such brutal conflict would also instinctively hurl itself into a lethal hazard to save an unrelated genetic line. In the Empire, one only sacrificed themselves for the pack or the sovereign. Tamsin rested her chin on her hand, offering a quiet, very human explanation. She told him that it was precisely because humans knew exactly how dark the dark could get. They were intimately familiar with the worst-case scenario, because they understood how easily everything could be taken away. The act of saving a single life had become a desperate, almost feral instinct. They fought hard, but they rescued harder, because pulling someone out of the dark was the only way to prove the dark had not won. That simple philosophy seemed to settle over the group, quietly healing the unseen fractures between them. The sterile academic meetings transformed into something warmer. They began sharing their synthesized meal rations. They spent an entire evening fiercely debating the mathematical structure of classical earth music. At one point, Tamsin delivered a deadpan, ridiculous joke about a localized atmospheric phenomenon, and the resulting burst of laughter from the group startled a passing maintenance drone. It was a beautiful, strange harmony. Nobody in the Academy would have ever believed that the terrifying apex predator from a death world could sit cross-legged on the floor, laughing softly with a telepath, a gravity bender, and a being made of solid light. The fragile peace shattered on the 5th day of their preparations. Luma was attempting to optimize the visual interface for the presentation's opening sequence. She needed the raw environmental telemetry from the day the classroom simulation collapsed to prove exactly how much kinetic force Tamsin had actively restrained. She accessed the Academy's central security mainframe, her light fingers dancing rapidly across the crystalline interface. Suddenly, her internal illumination flickered to a harsh, warning yellow. She projected the data logs onto the center of the table, the specific files containing the atmospheric pressure readings, the localized gravity fluctuations, and the psionic spike records from that exact hour were gone. They had not been corrupted by the power surge. They had been surgically and deliberately deleted. Someone had manually wiped the evidence of the external manipulation that had pushed Kaylor and Irix to the breaking point. Irix immediately dropped into a deep trance, casting their mind along the digital echo of the deletion command. They bypassed the standard firewalls, feeling for the residual psychic intent left behind by the user who had executed the purge. When Irix opened their eyes, the temperature in the garden seemed to drop several degrees. The digital footprint belonged to a localized militaristic student faction. The exact signature led directly to Axor Dran, the heavily plated soldier Tamsin had neutralized in the maintenance corridor. Kaylor pushed his aristocratic security clearance to its absolute limit, tracking Axor's current network activity through the station's grid. The group, huddled around the glowing map of the Asterian Ring. The tracking beacon did not point to the student dormitories, the combat arenas, or the tactical simulation decks. The glowing red dot was situated in a highly restricted, heavily shielded sector deep beneath the Academy's foundation. It was a zone completely off-limits to students and faculty alike. Aexor Dran somehow possessed unauthorized, direct access to the lowest sub-level of the station, the exact subterranean chamber where the sleeping core of the ancient archive was housed. The descent into the absolute lowest sub-level of the Academy took exactly 2 hours. Tamsin, Luma, Kalor, and Eriex moved through the forgotten maintenance shafts in total silence, leaving the brightly lit, modern corridors far above them. The architecture down here did not belong to the current era. It was a suffocating maze of smooth, dark surfaces that pulsed with a faint, cold light, built by hands that had vanished from the universe millions of years ago. The engineering faculties claimed the station was built on top of this foundation, but nobody truly understood the physics keeping the immense pressure of the void at bay. Luma pressed her small, glowing hands against the heavy, featureless obsidian slab blocking their path. By carefully modulating her bioluminescent frequencies, she tricked the ancient optical sensors into registering her as a recognized light key. The slab slid back with a heavy, grinding groan, revealing the hidden memory vault. Inside, the air was stale and tasted faintly of charged ozone. Eriex immediately interfaced with the central data spire, their dampening collar glowing a soft blue in the dark room. Kalor stood by the door, maintaining a subtle gravity ward to alert them of any approaching footsteps. Tamsin watched the holographic projections spring to life. They had come to find out why her species was classified so poorly. But the truth they uncovered was infinitely more sinister than a simple bureaucratic error. Eriex pulled up Earth's original assessment file. It had not been misfiled. Exactly 75 solar cycles ago, a powerful coalition of militaristic core world oligarchs had deliberately and systematically flattened the data. They had stripped away all records of human empathy, artistic achievement, and philosophical resilience, leaving only the image of a moderately adaptable, highly aggressive primate. The horrifying motive became clear as Eriex translated the ancient archive's core programming directives. The colossal machine did not evaluate empires based on their ability to conquer or enforce absolute order. It specifically sought out civilizations born from profound instability. It favored species that could endure massive moral and biological contradictions without collapsing into self-destruction. To the ancient rulers of the galaxy, whose entire empires relied on rigid caste systems and absolute, unyielding obedience, this criterion was a death sentence. If a chaotic, emotionally volatile species like humanity was ever recognized as a legitimate guardian of the archive, it would prove that their draconian models of supreme control were obsolete. Recognizing humanity meant unraveling the foundational power structures of the entire galactic hierarchy. The old empires needed the galaxy to believe humans were mindless beasts, so the current rulers could maintain their grip on the throne. Fascinating, isn't it? A harsh voice echoed from the vault entrance. Kalor's gravity ward shattered with a sharp crack. Aexor Dran stepped into the dim light of the vault, flanked by 4 heavily armored enforcers from his tactical cohort. They had masked their approach using military-grade thermal dampeners. Aexor did not draw his weapon immediately. His posture was terrifyingly calm, driven by deep ideological certainty. "We do not harbor any personal hatred for you, Tamsin," Aexor stated, his voice completely devoid of the usual student arrogance. "Your physical capabilities are quite impressive, but we simply cannot allow your kind to step onto the council floor. Order is the only force keeping a trillion different species from tearing each other apart. If this ancient relic validates your chaotic, unpredictable biology, the lesser systems will rebel. The old, stable order will fall. We are not acting out of malice. We are preserving the peace of the galaxy." "By lying to everyone," Tamsin replied, shifting her weight evenly onto both feet. Her eyes locked on his tactical belt. "History is written by those who keep the peace," Exor countered coldly. He gave a subtle nod to his enforcers. "Purge the spire." The ambush exploded into violence. Exor lunged forward, igniting a crackling thermal blade from his gauntlet. He aimed a brutal, sweeping strike directly at Tamsin's chest. She calculated the trajectory and moved to sidestep the lethal heat, preparing to use his forward momentum against him. But a sudden, massive spike in localized mass violently altered her footing. Kaelor threw himself entirely off balance, stepping directly between Tamsin and the descending thermal blade. The searing energy weapon sliced effortlessly through the thick fabric of his aristocratic uniform and bit deeply into his shoulder. Kaelor let out a sharp gasp of agony, dropping to one knee. Despite the horrific burn, the young nobleman did not retreat. He channeled the pain into a ferocious, undirected gravity wave that slammed into Exor's chest, throwing the heavy soldier backward against the obsidian wall with a sickening crunch. Kaelor, the heir to a bloodline built on supremacy and pride, had just traded his own flesh to shield a human, obliterating centuries of prejudice in a single, desperate heartbeat. Tamsin grabbed Kaelor by his uninjured arm, hauling him upright. "We need to go! Right now!" They sprinted toward the secondary extraction bulkhead at the rear of the vault, dragging Kaelor along. The heavy metal doors were locked tight, requiring a synchronized bio-neural bypass to trigger the release mechanisms from the inside. Tamsin stared at the incomprehensible ancient glyphs glowing on the panel. Irix lacked the physical dexterity to manipulate the heavy manual overrides fast enough before Exor's squad recovered. "Let me in!" Irix demanded frantically, reaching out toward Tamsin's face. "Lower your mental shields. I need to guide your hands." Tamsin did not hesitate. She dropped every psychological barrier she possessed. For exactly 4 seconds, the human and the telepath shared a single consciousness. Irix braced themselves, expecting to be crushed by the chaotic, deafening noise they had experienced in the classroom. Instead, they plunged into a terrifyingly deep, freezing ocean of pure, incandescent rage. Tamsin was furious. The betrayal, the engineered prejudice, the sight of Kaelor's burnt flesh. It was a volcanic pressure demanding violent retribution against Exor. But what shocked the telepath to their very core was that Tamsin was not consumed by the fury. She was holding it. She gripped the immense anger in a mental vice, consciously shoving the primal desire to kill aside. She forced her mind to remain absolutely focused on the intricate sequence of the door lock, prioritizing the safety of Luma and Kaelor over her own vengeance. In that fleeting connection, Irix realized the most dangerous thing about humanity was not their capacity for violence. It was their terrifying ability to carry apocalyptic anger within their hearts, yet still choose the path of protection. Tamsin's hands flew across the console, guided by Irix's translation. The heavy bulkhead doors slammed shut behind them, sealing the tunnel just as a barrage of plasma fire scorched the metal where they had been standing a second earlier. They escaped into the dark maintenance shafts, clutching a small, fragmented memory drive containing the proof of the data manipulation. However, the cost was devastating. While they were fleeing, Exor's enforcers had initiated a localized digital purge. The vast majority of the carefully curated presentation files they had spent the entire week assembling, the human music, the poetry, the historical context, was completely eradicated from the Academy's network. By the time they smuggled the bleeding Kaelor into the covert medical bay on the upper levels, the station's internal gossip network was already ablaze with a newly fabricated narrative. The rumors spread like a virulent plague. The official story claimed that the human exchange student, driven by predatory instincts, had violently assaulted a security patrol and broken into the forbidden catacombs in a desperate attempt to steal ancient, pre-galactic weaponry. Later that evening, Tamsin stood in Headmaster Elira's quiet office, her uniform still stained with Kalor's blood. She placed the fragmented data drive on the wooden desk. Elira reviewed the encrypted files, her luminescent skin shifting to a troubled, deep violet. The ancient being looked up, her expression grave. She stated that the political climate had become entirely too volatile. She wanted to officially postpone the Civilization Integration Summit by at least 3 lunar cycles to allow the security forces to investigate Axor and let the public hysteria die down. Tamsin shook her head firmly. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed the unyielding density of iron. She realized that postponing the event was exactly what the saboteurs wanted. A delay was a surrender. It meant handing the entire galactic narrative directly to the military factions. If humanity hid in the shadows now, confirming the rumors of their guilt by their absence, they would never be allowed to stand in the light again. Exactly at midnight, a violent, physical shudder ripped through the entire Asterian ring. It was not a mechanical failure of the station's modern thrusters. Deep below them, the sleeping core of the ancient archive began to glow with a sickly, unstable crimson light. A system-wide automated warning chimed simultaneously across every single data slate on the Orbital Academy. The archaic machine had lost its internal equilibrium due to the violent, unauthorized energy discharges within its vault. The translation matrix provided a terrifying, absolute ultimatum. If the core was not perfectly resynchronized by a recognized guardian consciousness during the public activation the following morning, the machine would trigger a catastrophic, localized spatial collapse to protect itself. A massive section of the Asterian ring's structural integrity would fail, instantly exposing thousands of students and faculty members to the lethal, freezing vacuum of deep space. The pristine holographic arrays and the carefully curated historical milestones were gone. Axor's purge had violently wiped the human archives clean, leaving Tamsin and her allies with zero digital evidence to present to the galactic stage. They retreated to the darkened, humid confines of the Botanical Annex. Instead of assembling a fabricated, diplomatic lie, they realized they had to offer the unvarnished truth. They could not rely on slick data streams. They would have to become the presentation themselves, utilizing raw memories, lived experiences, and their own physical presence as indisputable witnesses. Tamsin sat on the cold metal grating of the floor, drafting her opening statement on a physical, synthetic paper notepad she had brought all the way from Earth. She deliberately crossed out every single sentence that sounded like a plea for acceptance. She wrote that humans were absolutely not asking to be perceived as harmless. They were profoundly dangerous. They were deeply flawed. They were a species born from chaos, and they were merely asking to be perceived in their absolute entirety, without the comforting, sanitized filter of a manufactured galactic threat assessment. To be seen as whole was the only victory she cared about. Luma sat beside her, her internal light casting a soft, warm glow against the dark metal bulkheads. She looked at Tamsin and admitted a terribly hard truth. Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of her honesty. "When I close my eyes, I still see you diving through that gravity shear," the fragile photobiotic girl confessed. "My bioluminescence fades because I am still terrified of the violence you are capable of unleashing." She reached out, her small, translucent hand resting gently over Tamsin's scarred knuckles. "But I am actively choosing to stay right here beside you. Trust that does not require overcoming sheer terror is just convenience. Real faith means knowing exactly how dangerous you are, and believing you will protect me anyway." Across the room, Kalor was rigidly rehearsing his own contribution. His right arm was tightly bound in a fresh, sterilized medical sling, a stark reminder of the thermal blade he had intercepted. The supreme aristocratic pride that had defined his lineage for 10,000 years was entirely absent from his posture. He planned to stand before the entire Galactic Assembly, the politicians, the media, and his own peers, to formally apologize. He would publicly confess that, if the human exchange student had not intervened in the simulation hall, his unchecked anger would have turned him into a mass murderer. It was a devastating admission that would likely result in his immediate excommunication from his noble house, stripping him of his titles and his inheritance. He rehearsed the words until his voice cracked, accepting the permanent exile his honesty would bring. Erix offered the most terrifying sacrifice of all: to truly convey the complex, contradictory human experience. Spoken words would inevitably fail. The telepath volunteered to drop every single neural dampener during the summit. They would open a massive direct resonance channel, broadcasting Tamsin's raw, unfiltered memories straight into the emotional centers of every sentient entity in the auditorium. For a resonant mind species, deliberately exposing their unshielded consciousness to the chaotic, psychic weight of thousands of strangers was practically suicidal. It required stripping away every layer of psychological armor, leaving their mind completely naked and vulnerable to the collective shock of the crowd. At precisely 2 a.m, the ambient lighting in the botanical annex died. The steady, comforting hum of the environmental regulators faded into a heavy, dead silence. Aexor's faction had successfully severed the main power conduit to their specific sector. A petty, desperate tactic meant to break their resolve and plunge them into despair. Instead, the automated emergency protocols instantly triggered. The room was suddenly bathed in the harsh, arterial red glow of the backup luminaries. Sitting in the bloody, flashing light, surrounded by the shifting shadows of overgrown alien flora, the group did not panic. They simply continued to practice. Kaelor spoke his apology into the red dark. Erix focused their breathing, preparing for the psychic onslaught. Tamsin memorized the hard lines of her speech. The sterile, highly polished presentation they had originally planned was entirely gone. What remained in that freezing room was raw, visceral, and undeniably real. The sheer adversity of the moment made their resolve infinitely more authentic than any heavily produced holographic display could ever achieve. It was a perfect, striking reflection of humanity itself. They were building a foundation in the dark. Headmaster Alira entered the annex just an hour before dawn. Her swirling, luminescent skin was muted by the harsh red emergency strobes. The ancient being carried a grim, final warning. The core of the ancient archive, buried deep beneath their feet, was destabilizing significantly faster than the engineering faculties had projected. If the massive machine fractures during the public activation, Alira explained, her voice heavy with the sorrow of 1,000 lifetimes, a system-wide reset will fail. The resulting spatial collapse will consume the entire quadrant. She paused, letting the heavy silence emphasize the absolute gravity of her words. There is only one failsafe left. A living consciousness must physically enter the absolute center of the core and manually synchronize the conflicting data streams, using their own neural architecture as a living bridge to absorb the paradox. Alira looked directly at the lone human. The sheer, infinite volume of contradictory data will completely obliterate the host's mind. The chance of biological survival is functionally zero. Tamsin did not look at Kaelor, Luma, or Erix. She stared directly into the nebula eyes of the headmaster and gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. She made the silent, unbreakable vow right then and there. If the core shattered, if the machine demanded a sacrifice to spare the station, she would be the one to walk into the fire. Words and speeches could only do so much to change a prejudiced galaxy. If these alien empires were ever going to truly understand humanity, someone had to prove that humans were willing to bleed, to break, and to die for a universe that had done nothing but hate them. The sun finally rose on the day of the Civilization Integration Summit. The grand auditorium, a staggering architectural marvel designed to comfortably hold 100,000 individuals, was filled to absolute capacity. The air inside the colossal chamber was thick and suffocating with anticipation. Nervous students, esteemed faculty members, hardened political observers dispatched from the core worlds, and the flashing, invasive lenses of major interstellar media syndicates crammed into every available viewing tier. The entire galaxy was watching. The ambient noise of 100,000 breathing entities settled into a heavy, unbroken silence as the main stage remained dark. They sat on the edge of their seats, staring at the massive, sealed blast doors, waiting to see exactly how the anomaly from Earth would finally present itself. They waited to see if the solitary human would drop to her knees and beg for mercy, violently demand a seat of power, or simply tear herself apart before the eyes of the cosmos. The main stage of the grand auditorium remained completely stripped of the usual holographic grandeur. Tamsin stood before 100,000 silent observers, armed only with the raw, unshielded truth. She spoke of Earth not as a pristine paradise, but as a beautiful, agonizing crucible. She described a world where tectonic plates fractured and violent atmospheric storms raged, forging a species that had to fight tooth and nail simply to exist. Beside her, Luma stepped into the stark lighting. Her bioluminescence pulsed softly as she recounted the sheer terror of the falling crystalline shard in the simulation hall, and the terrifying, unconditional kinetic force of the human that had pulled her from the brink of death. Then, Kalor stepped forward. The heir to a 10,000-year-old dynasty lowered his head and publicly confessed his profound shame. He admitted to the entire galaxy that his ancestral pride had nearly turned him into a murderer, and a fragile human exchange student had to save him from his own darkness. Finally, Erix dropped every single neural dampener. A massive wave of pure, translated memory washed over the colossal chamber. The audience did not just hear the words, they physically felt the terrifying weight of human empathy and the sharp, bright sting of alien forgiveness. The colossal audience fractured into two distinct halves. One side leaned forward, deeply moved by the absolute vulnerability and sincerity of the interspecies group. The other half recoiled, their faces twisting with cynical disbelief, thoroughly convinced this was merely a highly sophisticated emotional manipulation designed by a predatory species seeking unearned power. Just as Tamsin reached into her pocket to produce the fragmented data drive proving the deliberate falsification of Earth's historical archives, the auditorium plunged into absolute darkness. The massive display screens behind the stage violently ignited. Axor Dran had successfully hijacked the central transmission relay from his hidden bunker. He did not broadcast fabricated lies. He broadcast humanity's darkest, most undeniable truths. Unforgiving, high-definition historical footage of Earth's most horrific atrocities flooded the chamber. The audience was brutally bombarded with images of nuclear fire consuming cities, the mechanized slaughter of global wars, and the callous destruction of an entire biosphere. A collective wave of absolute terror and disgust rippled through the stands. The political observers immediately began calling for strict quarantine protocols and military intervention. Tamsin did not look away from the burning screens. She did not raise her voice to deny the bloodshed, nor did she attempt to neatly whitewash her species' horrific past. She stepped to the very edge of the stage and spoke with a quiet, undeniable density that cut straight through the rising panic. She stated clearly that humanity had indeed committed unspeakable horrors. She confessed openly that her people possessed the capacity to become absolute monsters. But, she argued fiercely, that was precisely why their empathy was so powerful. Because they intimately knew the absolute depths of their own cruelty. Humans had to forge morality and compassion, not as a natural biological default, but as a desperate, unyielding survival discipline. They chose to be good because they knew exactly what happened when they surrendered to the dark. High above in the hidden control spire, Aexor initiated his final, catastrophic maneuver. He bypassed the last safety protocols and forced the ancient archive core into a total state of critical overload. His goal was to mathematically force the ancient machine to officially label humanity as a chaotic contagion, thereby authorizing their immediate eradication by the galactic fleets. The entire orbital academy violently shuddered. Localized gravity phases fractured, sending entire seeding tiers floating helplessly into the air while crushing others against the deck plating. A toxic tide of raw, chaotic psychic energy washed over the audience, dropping thousands of telepaths to their knees in agony. The ancient relic beneath the station screamed as conflicting data streams tore at its foundational logic. Yet, amidst the apocalyptic breakdown, the ancient machine bypassed Exor's rigid, militaristic logic. It did not calculate pure innocence. It calculated absolute truth. The core isolated Tamsin's neural signature, recognizing her as an entity capable of maintaining perfect consistency across infinite contradictions. It saw a creature who fully embraced her own internal darkness, yet actively used her terrifying physical strength to build a shield rather than a sword. The central floor of the stage violently retracted, revealing the blinding, swirling vortex of the destabilizing core. Without a single second of hesitation, Tamsin threw herself directly into the blinding light. Above her, her team anchored the crumbling reality. Kaelor pushed his biology to the absolute limit, bleeding from his nose as he held the fracturing gravitational fields together with pure, agonizing willpower. Irix established a massive, desperate psychic bridge, shielding Tamsin's mind from the worst of the digital storm tearing through the chamber. Luma wove a glowing, intricate net of solid biological light, physically restructuring the severed data pathways to keep the connection alive. Inside the raging heart of the machine, Tamsin had to synchronize her very soul. She matched her rapid heartbeat and steady breath to the terrifying, conflicting memories of her entire species. She wove the bitter agony of war with the transcendent beauty of music. She balanced profound loss with fierce compassion. She anchored the primal instinct to survive with the willing capacity to sacrifice. She forced the chaotic data into a single, stable resonance. The core began to stabilize, its chaotic crimson shifting to a calm, infinite blue. But a violent spatial collapse suddenly tore through the upper control spire. Exor Dran was thrown from his terminal, trapped helplessly within a crushing gravitational anomaly of his own making. The machine presented Tamsin with a final, brutal choice. She could remain in the safe center of the synchronized core and let her saboteur die, a mathematically justified casualty of his own hubris. Instead, the human turned her back on the safe zone. She lunged into the collapsing space, grabbed the terrified soldier by his heavy armor, and violently dragged him back into the light. The conscious decision to save the very architect of her destruction was the final key. The ancient archive accepted the ultimate paradox. The machine rebooted with a sound like a universal heartbeat. It projected a new, unforgeable profile of humanity across the entire station and out into the deepest reaches of the galaxy. The data did not show a perfect savior or a mindless beast. It displayed a predator and a creator, a creature of devastating flaws and breathtaking poetry, capable of immense violence and profound care, defined entirely by its sheer, relentless ability to fall down and stand back up. The political knots instantly unraveled. The truth had finally outrun the fear and the propaganda. Days later, as the repaired station slowly returned to normal operations, Tamsin walked into her morning xenodynamics lecture. The heavy, suffocating isolation that had plagued her was entirely gone. She walked to the middle row and sat at her usual desk. A moment later, Kaelor walked down the aisle, followed closely by Luma and Irix. Without a single word of hesitation, The alien students took the empty seats right next to her, voluntarily anchoring themselves to the human who had taught them how to weather the storm. Thank you all for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Remember to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.